Um, Welcome to episode 52. Illusions Exist. Back to the regular scheduled name. Um, Now, new viewers might not be familiar with longtime viewer Kenneth Katona, star of Sagittarius, and he's asked me a question in comments, which is a good way to ask me a question. And I'm happy to make at least a short video. And although I'm going to try to keep it short, I did think this through. Now, it's not necessarily going to show in the sense that I didn't prepare, like, hey, an answer per se. Taking the topics, this one brings up a lot of dichotomies that are used in philosophy, ethics, uh, various other parts of philosophical systems. Okay, so here's the question. He says, there's no question mark in it. He makes a comment. The more I look into intrinsic versus extrinsic value, I find the latter becomes totally useless in regards to having any useful meaning and purpose. Perhaps you can expound upon this since you have a philosophical technique of integrity. It's a nice compliment. Sometimes get random uncompliments as well. Both are fair play. I'm just trying to figure out what they mean. And what I'm saying here is that, Kenneth, I don't really know which direction you're coming from except for what you say in the comment, which is you're finding extrinsic value to be totally useless. And I have a lot of reactions to this, but first let me make sure that we are getting audio correctly. And what I'm saying here is that we are. All right. Um, Now, first of all, I want to refer everybody to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Questions like this, they're fairly fair-minded. They'll give you whatever the current state of the controversy. They teach the controversy. They'll say most people think this, some people argue this, and so on and so forth. And insofar as they advocate for an attitude, it's sort of what'll get you a B, and to get an A, you'd have to memorize all the different views. This goes into a lot of stuff, really. And it starts off pointing out that it's traditionally at the heart of ethics. Now, it's bigger than this. Now, the basic idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic value or characteristics and qualities is this question of whether or not a thing has a quality in itself or the things that are not in themselves. Now, what kind of quality could not be in yourself? Well, for example, your location on Earth. You're in this part of the room versus that part of the room. That would be considered usually as not intrinsic to yourself. Now, in a computer model, where you have a little model of the data that applies in the object, it's going to have the position, right? And this just shows that logically there's an arbitrary nature to whether you consider something intrinsic or extrinsic. But generally, we're separating things. It's just the whole old thing that we do through evolution that all the mammals, all the animals seem to do of identifying things, other things. Now, in identifying ourselves as a thing, you have to assume that that comes later. The baby gets all of the sense perceptions, sees that the ball is a thing, that mom is a thing, different from dad, and all of that. But it's later that it, and maybe only because it's human, you kind of think one thing animals might never really get is that they're a thing in the world. It actually seems that the world is a thing and the things in the world are the thing, but I'm just the perceiver. I'm the thing in itself, right? So in philosophy, the classical philosophy up to, not necessarily the latest stuff, but like up to Kant and stuff, we have this concept, and it is used afterwards, but of a thing in itself, you know. And of course, it's very difficult because since things are made out of atoms and parts and whatnot, it's hard to, there's no atom, no atomic identity. And yet, there is means of identity. I mean, a drop of water internally versus externally, you know, there's a water barrier, there's a surface tension that separates it electrically and other energies. You know, there's a barrier where you can't identify one from the other, but it's all like identifying clouds. Like, yeah, there's definitely a cloud there, but at the edge, you know, it fades off into water molecules, and it's a bit of a judgment call. And that's what we kind of find, I think, in modern logic, is you can't draw sharp boundaries. So intrinsic and intrinsic are like this. Now, I, as a relativist, would tend towards intrinsic, belief in intrinsic, but I understand the idea that it's valueless, that it feels valueless, because you're just saying the value is somehow external to the thing. So, like, what if I play great jazz piano? That's the value isn't in me; it's my relationship to the piano. Um, well, that's exactly the thing. Intrinsic and extrinsic is kind of, let's say, it's old-fashioned way of looking this at the first person versus the third person. Your inside question versus your outside question. Your material versus teleological, right? So, in one sense, when you're talking about 3D objects, that we're looking at our external world and the value of things that are external to me. So we'll talk about me in a second. This pen has a value. I can write with it, very useful to write with. And is that in the pen? Well, it's not really in my hand. I mean, I need the pen to do it. It works like a lot like programming with that positional thing. You know, to consider it as if it's the pen, that's fine, but it is really my relationship to the pen. I can use it to write. It doesn't write on its own. And I could get a stick and write in the sand. It might not be as valuable as a writing implement as this, but it's the relationship of me using it as a writing implement. Now, where intrinsic is really important, and in human ethics, how people treat people, and then also how we treat other living things, um, it's a living thing that is a thing in itself. That's the thing that seems intrinsic. So while we look at a pen and it's just chemicals and rocks and stones, and we look at the stick and we can use them various ways and put them to particular use, and other people also share that kind of use, right? And so that always breaks down into atoms, and wait, what if I use a pen to pry open something? Then it's a lever, you know, and it creates this vagueness, whereas the truly thing in itself, or intrinsic thing, and where we get this metaphor, why we're thinking about it so much, is it's the conscious stream of mind, where that is a value in itself to us. In other words, our feeling that things have intrinsic value comes from our intrinsic value of survival. So then suddenly, things you really need for survival, like air, might as well, you know, mathematically equivalent from your point of view as an intrinsic value. But then you look and say, well, I'm an object in the world, and there are other people are objects in the world. If I have an intrinsic value, why do they not act like I have a value in itself? Well, that's a moot question, because you could, in principle, have intrinsic value, and they just want to steal that value or whatever. But on the other hand, you know, in a fully skeptical relativistic, uh-oh, oh, COVID. But anyway, why the taste of flavor of lemon? I like it, has an intrinsic value to me. Extrinsic, well, really a healthy version of that would be talking about the value that other people put on it. So let's say I'm organizing a barbecue, and I get to order the cupcakes, and I love lemon cake, but you know, only 10% of the people in the town do, and I know that. You know, I would recognize the extrinsic value of the chocolate cupcakes that everybody mostly wants. You know, I might buy 10% of this or 10, and 90% of that, but if I had to get all one kind, well, I'd probably go with where the extrinsic or multi-calculation, they both would have validity, and none of them would be fundamentally true. And that's why I like to use those words. This is a related but different. It's like once you have a materialist view, and the value is all posited by a human brain, and the objective part is its relationship. I objectively do use this to write. Whether that's good or not is going to fundamentally be subjective. But in terms of, well, if I want to write and I can use this to write, then it's going to have this value, just like the flavor of lemon is of intrinsic to me value. Other people don't see it as intrinsic. So fundamentally, it's not intrinsic. However, we living creatures are the creatures that project it. We create the value in the first place. From our point of view, it becomes intrinsic. If it's really something we want, it might be something that we're compelled to, like an addiction or whatever, and we should deal with that. And the best way to deal with all this to me is that intrinsic and extrinsic are not really that valuable of a dichotomy. Um, the remnant of what's useful of it is like to calculate what is intrinsic of intrinsic value to yourself. Like some people, they're adrenaline junkies, and they want to, skateboard all the time. Some people want a relaxing, a gentle breeze in the woods, and people could figure out what those things are for themselves, and that would count as intrinsic. Um, But if it was just a philosophical debate on those terms, and you go through this article and see what it says about intrinsic or extrinsic, well, and the idea of an intrinsic value is a little bit religious, as if somehow when things have been created by evolution or God or however anybody thinks they're created, that somehow it's just some value in itself. Like if this is, a pen, then it's just sitting there with the value of a pen. Even if everything else in the universe has decayed and it's the last thing in the universe, well, it was created by people, so it has that information imprint on it. And it can't be intrinsically any more for writing than the stick that a human first picked up and with charcoal burnt in and wrote with. So that is what I think about the general subject. And really, it's just opening a can of worms. As I said, if you take the common sense wisdom out of it, um, and focus on that you have a whole inside versus outside perspectives, right? You have the first person perspective, I and me, versus second and third, you and they, and the difference between living and non-living, the he, she, and the it's, the you versus the it, right? So with your brain applying these categories, you have a lot of dichotomies that you can use to deal with this inside perspective looking out versus outside perspective looking in, and versus judging other things and whether they fundamentally have an inside perspective. And in the end, the only thing with an inside perspective, and we can't explain why yet per se, is living things. The trillions and trillions of living things seem to have an inside perspective.